Chapter 3 Facing Finitude. You can't delve far into the question of what it means to be a finite human being with finite time on the planet before encountering the philosopher who was more obsessed with the subject than any other thinker, Martin Heidegger. This is unfortunate for two reasons, the most glaring one being that for more than a decade, starting in 1933, he was a card-carrying member of the Nazi Party. The question of what this means for his philosophy is fraught with fascination, but it would get us off track here. So you're going to have to decide for yourself whether this exceptionally poor life choice invalidates his thoughts about how we make life choices in general. The second reason is that he's almost impossible to read. His work abounds with broken-backed phrases such as being towards death and disseverance, and you might like to be sitting down for this next one. Anxiety in the face of that potentiality for being, which is one's own most. This is why nobody's interpretation of Heidegger's work, very much including mine, ought to be taken as definitive. Yet on the second charge of incomprehensibility, he does have a kind of defense. Everyday language reflects our everyday ways of seeing, but Heidegger wants to slide his fingernails under the most basic elements of existence, the things we barely notice because they're so familiar, so as to prize them away for our inspection. That means making things unfamiliar, using unfamiliar terms, so you stumble and trip over his writing, but sometimes as a consequence, you bang your head against reality. Thrown into time. The most fundamental thing we fail to appreciate about the world, Heidegger asserts in his magnum opus, Being and Time, is how bafflingly astonishing it is that it is there at all, the fact that there is anything rather than nothing. Most philosophers and scientists spend their careers pondering the way things are, what sorts of things exist, where they come from, how they relate to each other, and so on. But we've forgotten to be amazed that things are in the first place, that a world is worlding all around us, as Heidegger puts it. This fact, the fact that there is being to begin with, is the brute reality on which all of us ought to be constantly stubbing our toes. In the blended phrase of the writer Sarah Bakewell, but instead, it almost always passes us by. Having focused our attention on this ground-level issue of being itself, Heidegger next turns to humans specifically, and to our own particular kind of being. What does it mean for a human being to be? I realize this is starting to sound like a bad comedy sketch about philosophers lost in abstractions. I'm afraid that that's going to get worse for another couple of paragraphs before it gets better. His answer is that our being is totally, utterly bound up with our finite time. So bound up, in fact, that the two are synonymous. To be, for a human, is above all to exist temporarily, in the stretch between birth and death, certain that the end will come, yet unable to know when. We tend to speak about our having a limited amount of time, but it might make more sense from Heidegger's strange perspective to say that we are a limited amount of time. That's how completely our limited time defines us. Ever since Heidegger made this claim, philosophers have been disagreeing about what exactly it might mean to say that we are time. Some have even argued it doesn't mean anything, so we shouldn't get stuck on trying to clarify it with precision. It's sufficient to take from it the insight that every moment of human existence is completely shot through with the fact that Heidegger calls our finitude. Our limited time isn't just one among various things we have to cope with. Rather, it's the thing that defines us as humans before we start coping with anything at all. Before I can ask a single question about what I should do with my time, I find myself already thrown into time, into this particular moment with my particular life story, which has made me who I am and which I can never get out from under. Looking ahead to the future, I find myself equally constrained by my finitude. I'm being borne forward on the river of time with no possibility of stepping out of the flow, onward toward my inevitable death, which, to make matters even more ticklish, could arrive at any moment. In this situation, any decision I make To do anything at all with my time is already radically limited. For one thing, it's limited in a retrospective sense because I'm already who I am and where I am, which determines what possibilities are open to me. But it's also radically limited in a forward looking sense, too, not least because a decision to do any given thing will automatically mean sacrificing an infinite number of potential alternative paths. As I made hundreds of small choices throughout the day, I'm building a life, but at one and the same time, I'm closing off the possibility of countless others, forever. The original Latin word for decide, decidere, means to cut off, as in slicing away alternatives. It's a close cousin of words like homicide and suicide. Any finite life, even the best one you could possibly imagine, is therefore a matter of ceasingly waving goodbye to possibility. The only real question about all this finitude is whether we're willing to confront it or not. And this, for Heidegger, is the central challenge of human existence. Since finitude defines our lives, he argues that living a truly authentic life, becoming fully human, means facing up to that fact. We must live out our lives, to whatever extent we can, in clear-eyed acknowledgement of our limitations, in the undiluted mode of existence that Heidegger calls being towards death. Aware that this is it, that life is not a dress rehearsal, that every choice requires a myriad of sacrifices, and that time is always already running out. Indeed, that it may run out today, tomorrow, or next month. And so it's not merely a matter of spending each day as if it were your last, as the cliche has it. The point is that it always actually might be. I can't entirely depend upon a single moment of the future. Obviously, from any ordinary perspective, this all sounds intolerably morbid and stressful. But then, to the extent that you manage to achieve this outlook on life, you're not seeing it from an ordinary perspective, and morbid and stressful, at least according to Heidegger, are exactly what it is not. On the contrary, it's the only way for a finite human being to live fully, to relate to other people as full-fledged humans, and to experience the world as it truly is. What's really morbid, from this perspective, is what most of us do, most of the time, instead of confronting our finitude, which is to indulge in avoidance and denial, or what Heidegger calls falling. Rather than taking ownership of our lives, we seek out distractions, or lose ourselves in busyness and the daily grind, so as to try to forget our real predicament. Or we try to avoid the intimidating responsibility of having to decide what to do with our finite time by telling ourselves that we don't get to choose at all, that we must get married, or remain in a soul-destroying job, or anything else, simply because it's the done thing. Or, as we saw in the previous chapter, we embark on the futile attempt to get everything done, which is really another way of trying to evade the responsibility of deciding what to do with your finite time. Because if you actually could get everything done, you'd never have to choose among mutually exclusive possibilities. Life is usually more comfortable when you spend it avoiding the truth in this fashion. But it's a stultifying, deadly sort of comfort. It's only by facing our finitude that we can step into a truly authentic relationship with life. Getting real. In his 2019 book, This Life, the Swedish philosopher Martin Haglund makes this all a bit clearer and less mystical by juxtaposing the idea of facing our finitude with the religious belief in an eternal life. If you really thought life would never end, he argues, then nothing could ever genuinely matter, because you'd never be faced with having to decide whether or not to use a portion of your precious life on something. If I believed that my life would last forever, Haglund writes, I could never take my life to be at stake, and I would never be seized by the need to do anything with my time. Eternity would be deathly dull, because whenever you found yourself wondering whether or not to do any given thing on any given day, the answer would always be, who cares? After all, there is always tomorrow, and the next day, and the one after that. Haglund quotes a headline from the magazine U.S. Catholic that has the air of being written by a devout religious believer on whom an awful possibility has suddenly dawned. Heaven, will it be boring? By way of contrast, Haglund describes the annual summer vacation he spends with his extended family in a house on Sweden's wind-battered Baltic coast. It's intrinsic to the value of the experience. he notes, that he won't be around to experience it forever, that his relatives won't either, that his relationships with his relatives are therefore temporary too, and that even the coastline in its current form is a transient phenomenon, as dry land continues to emerge from the 12,000-year retreat of the region's glaciers. If Hagelin were guaranteed an infinity of these summer vacations, there'd be nothing much to value about any one of them. It's only the guarantee that he definitely won't have an infinity of them that makes them worth valuing. Indeed, it's only from this position of valuing what is finite because it's finite. Hagelin argues that one can truly care about the impact of a collective peril such as climate change, which is wreaking changes to his native country's landscape. If our earthly existence were merely the prelude to an eternity in heaven, threats to that existence couldn't matter in any ultimate sense. Of course, if you're not religious, and maybe even if you are, you might not literally believe in eternal life. But anyone who spends their days failing to confront the truth of their finitude, convincing themselves on a subconscious level that they all have the time in the world, or alternatively that they'll be able to cram an infinite amount into the time they do have, is essentially in the same boat. They're living in denial of the fact that their time is limited. So when it comes to deciding how to use any given portion of that time, nothing can genuinely be at stake for them. It is by consciously confronting the certainty of death and what follows from the certainty of death that we finally become truly present for our lives. This is the kernel of wisdom in the cliche of the celebrity who claims that a brush with cancer was the best thing that ever happened. It pitches them into a more authentic mode of being, in which everything suddenly feels more vividly meaningful. Such accounts sometimes give the impression that people reliably become happier as a result of facing the truth about death, which isn't the case. Happier is clearly the wrong word for the new depth that is added to life when you grasp, deep in your bones, the fact that you're going to die and that your time is therefore severely limited. But things certainly do get realer. As she recalls in her memoir, The Iceberg, the British sculptor Marianne Coutts was taking her 2-year-old son to his first day with a new caregiver when her husband, the art critic Tom Labach, came to find her to tell her about the malignant brain tumor from which he was to die within 3 years. Something has happened, a piece of news. We have had a diagnosis that has the status of an event. The news makes a rupture with what went before, clean, complete, and total, save in one respect. It seems that after the event, the decision we make is to remain. Our family unit stands. We learn something. We are mortal. You might say you know this, but you don't. The news falls neatly between one moment and another. You would not think there was a gap for such a thing. It is as if a new physical law has been described for us bespoke, absolute as all the others are, yet terrifyingly casual. It is a law of perception. It says, you will lose everything that catches your eye. In this case, this needs saying, it isn't that a diagnosis of terminal illness or a bereavement or any other encounter with death is somehow good or desirable or worth it, but such experiences, however wholly unwelcome, often appear to leave those who undergo them in a new and more honest relationship with time. The question is whether we might attain at least a little of that same outlook in the absence of the experience of agonizing loss. Writers have struggled to convey this particular quality that this mode of being infuses into life, because while happier is wrong, sadder doesn't convey it either. You might call it bright sadness, as does the priest and author Richard Rohr, stubborn gladness, the poet Jack Gilbert, or sober joy, the Heidegger scholar Bruce Ballard. Or you could just call it finally encountering real life, and the brute fact of our finite weeks. Everything is borrowed time. This is the point at which I should come clean and admit that unfortunately I don't live my own daily life in a permanent state of unflinching acceptance of my mortality. Perhaps nobody does. What I can confirm, though, is that if you can adopt the outlook we're exploring here even just a little, if you can hold your attention, however briefly or occasionally, on the sheer astoundingness of being, and on what a small amount of that being you get, you may experience a palpable shift in how it feels to be here, right now, alive in the flow of time. Or as the flow of time, Heideggerian might say. From an everyday standpoint, the fact that life is finite feels like a terrible insult, a sort of personal affront, a taking away of one's time. In the words of one scholar, there you were planning to live on forever, as the old Woody Allen line has it, not in the hearts of your countrymen, but in your apartment. But now here comes mortality, to steal away the life that was rightfully yours. Yet on reflection, there's something very entitled about this attitude. Why assume that an infinite supply of time is the default, and mortality the outrageous violation? Or to put it another way, why treat 4,000 weeks as a very small number, because it's so tiny compared with infinity, rather than treating it as a huge number, because it's so many more weeks than if you had never been born? Surely only someone who'd failed to notice how remarkable it is that anything is in the first place would take their own being as such a given, as if it were something they had every right to have conferred upon them, and never to have taken away. So maybe it's not that you've been cheated out of an unlimited supply of time. Maybe it's almost incomprehensibly miraculous to have been granted any time at all. The Canadian writer David Kane understood all this with a jolt in the summer of 2018 when he attended an event in the Greek town district of Toronto. The evening itself passed off unremarkably. I was early, he recalled, so I spent some time in the nearby park, then checked out the shops and the restaurants on Danforth Avenue. I stopped in front of a church to tie my shoe. I remember being nervous about meeting a bunch of new people. Then 2 weeks later, on the same stretch of street, a deranged man shot 14 people, killing 2 of them, then killing himself. Rationally speaking, Kane concedes this wasn't a narrow escape on his part. Thousands of people walk down Danforth Avenue every day, and it wasn't as if he'd missed the shooting by only a few minutes. Even so, the sense that it could have been him, caught in the gunfire, was sufficiently powerful to bring into focus what it meant that it hadn't been him. When I watch videos of eyewitness accounts, including some in front of the church where I tied my shoes and the corner where I nervously loitered, he wrote later, it gave me a vital bit of perspective. I happen to be alive, and there's no cosmic law entitling me to that status. Being alive is just happenstance. Not one more day of it is guaranteed. This kind of perspective shift, I've found, has an especially striking effect on the experience of everyday annoyances on my response to traffic jams and airport security lines, babies who won't sleep past 5 a.m., and dishwashers that I apparently must unload again tonight. Even though I think you'll find I did so yesterday. I'm embarrassed to admit what an outsized negative effect such minor frustrations have had on my happiness over the years. Fairly often they still do, but the effect was worse at the height of my productivity geekhood, because when you're trying to master your time, few things are more infuriating than a task or delay that's foisted upon you against your will, with no regard for the schedule you've been painstakingly drawn up in over your overpriced notebook. But when you turn your attention instead to the fact that you're in a position to have an irritating experience in the first place, matters are liable to look very different indeed. All at once, it can seem amazing to be there at all, having any experience in a way that's overwhelmingly more important than the fact that the experience happens to be an annoying one. Geoff Lai, a British environmental consultant, once told me that after the sudden and premature death of his friend and colleague David Watson, he found himself stuck in traffic, not clenching his fist in agitation as per usual, but wondering, what would David have given to be caught in this traffic jam? It was the same for queues in supermarkets and customer service lines that kept him on hold too long. Lai's focus was no longer exclusively on what he was doing in such moments or what he'd rather be doing instead. Now he noticed that he was doing it with an upwelling of gratitude that took him by surprise. And now consider what all this means for the crucial and basic question of choosing what to do with your limited time. As if we've seen, it's a fact of life that, as finite human, you're always making hard choices, so that, for example, in spending this afternoon on one thing that mattered to me, writing, I necessarily had to forgo many other things that mattered too, like playing with my son. It's natural to see this situation as highly regrettable, and to yearn for some alternative version of existence in which we wouldn't have to choose between valued activities in this way. But if it's amazing to have been granted any being at all, if your whole life is borrowed time, as Kane realized, watching news reports of the Danforth Avenue shootings, then wouldn't it make it more sense to speak not of having to make such choices, but of getting to make them? From this point, the situation starts to seem much less regrettable. Each moment of decision becomes an opportunity to select from an enticing menu of possibilities when you might easily never have been presented with the menu to begin with. And it stops making sense to pity yourself for having been cheated of all the other options. In this situation, making a choice, picking one item from the menu, far from representing some kind of defeat, becomes an affirmation. It's a positive commitment to spend a given portion of time doing this instead of that. Actually, instead of an infinite number of other that's, because this, you've decided, is what counts the most right now. In other words, it's precisely the fact that I could have chosen a different and perhaps equally valuable way to spend this afternoon that bestows meaning on the choice I did make. And the same applies, of course, to an entire lifetime. For instance, it's precisely the fact that getting married forecloses the possibility of meeting someone else, someone who might genuinely have been a better marriage partner, who could ever say, that makes marriage meaningful. The exhilaration that sometimes arises when you grasp this truth about finitude has been called the joy of missing out, by way of a deliberate contrast with the idea of the fear of missing out. It is the thrilling recognition that you wouldn't even really want to be able to do everything, since if you didn't have to decide what to miss out on, your choices couldn't truly mean anything. In this state of mind, you can embrace the fact that you're foregoing certain pleasures or neglecting certain obligations, because whatever you've decided to do instead, earn money to support your family, write your novel, bathe the toddler, pause on a hiking trail to watch a pale winter sun sink below the horizon at dusk, is how you've chosen to spend a portion of time that you never had any right to expect.